Well, hello and welcome everyone to the Fall 2024 Improving Restorations webinar series. This is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota Extension and the State of Minnesota Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. We're covering a range of topics in this series, with the first being a seeding best practices. I'm Wade Johnson with Minnesota DNR, also on behalf of the Board of Water and Soil Resources, working on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. Our program collaborates with experts to evaluate restorations, identify what's working and ongoing challenges, and working through venues such as this webinar series, share information to improve future restorations. Our collaborating partners in this webinar series are the University of Minnesota Extension. Julia Bonin with Extension is here with us today and will field questions for the Q&A after presentations. Extension offers an online ecological restoration certificate program. This 150-hour program of 5 courses is offered twice a year and covers foundational skills for engaging in restoration projects. It's an exceptional resource for the state of Minnesota and the upper Midwest. I encourage you all to check it out and share this great practical educational resource. During our webinar today, as questions and comments arise, please encourage you to post questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. There is also a chat feature that you can use if you're having technical issues. But please use the Q&A for questions, and we'll have time after both presentations are completed to field those questions with Q&A with the speakers. At the end of our webinar today, when you close Zoom, a pop-up window will appear prompting you to complete a short survey. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as it provides valuable feedback for us about your interest and potential topics for future webinars. So please take a moment to do that. Our webinar series will be recorded and available on the Extension website. Upcoming 3 webinars in the series will be held every other week, Thursdays at noon, covering topics in restoring oak savannas, soils and restoration, and moving beyond reed canary grass. Now to introduce our speakers for today. Karin Jokela is Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the NRCS and NRCS Partner Biologist with Xerces Society. Karin provides pollinator-related technical support and training to NRCS field office conservation planners and farmers, primarily in southern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. She works with landowners to design, implement, and evaluate restoration efforts. Karin manages a small native plant nursery on her and her husband's organic vegetable farm. Our second speaker today is Shawn May. Shawn is a private land biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Shawn has been restoring wetlands and prairies in the Detroit Lakes Wetland Management District since 2003. Annually, he broadcasts around 300 acres of native prairie seed on former cropland. Shawn is involved in all aspects of upland restoration program in Detroit Lakes, from harvesting seeds, selecting harvest sites, bagging seed, and driving the equipment during the seeding process. And with that, I will let Karin take away the presentation. So I stop sharing.
Okay. I believe you should be able to see my screen. So unless somebody chimes in otherwise, I will go ahead. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm super impressed by how many people are tuning in right now, and also feeling very humbled knowing that many of you who are tuning in have more experience on the ground than I do. So here I am, humbly offering some ideas. Wade already told you a little bit about who I am, but just to remind you, the context in which I usually work is with farmers, conservation staff, particularly those who work for NRCS. Basically agricultural spaces. So that's kind of, and not so much on like public lands management. So just the context I think is important here. So let's see here. I'm going to advance my slides. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Xerces Society, this is sort of my obligatory introduction, which is that we are a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitats. So we are science-based. working with all these collaborators, many of you in the room here. We don't do this work alone. We really try to make practical solutions when we digest the science and help you achieve success in your restorations. I'm gonna just put one slide really briefly to say, like, we have one of our great strengths is developing all these technical guidance documents for you. And I'll just go back to that for a second. And these are all available as downloadable PDFs that you can find on our website. You can find more information on YouTube and so forth. So go check out those resources. This is just the tip of the iceberg on what's available. I also feel obliged to explain that there's this known process for doing prairie reconstructions. And this, I feel a little bit awkward doing this presentation, jumping right into seeding practices because it's as if that's the start of the reconstruction process when it's really just the middle of the process. And so what I'm trying to highlight here is that there are these other phases that we're not going to have time to talk about today. And we're really going to just dive right into the site prep phase, but just acknowledging that there are these other phases that come first. They're required to come first. And these are just, this is one slide, just one slide kind of highlighting some of the things that occur in phases 1 and 2. And you can see that in phases 1 and 2 of reconstruction, you have to look ahead all the way to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th steps in the process so that you can make good decisions on the front end in that planning part. So these are just some of those required kind of homework considerations. Once you have done these considerations, then you can start making decisions about the seed mix. And fundamentally, a seed mix is like a combination of 3 choices: the species you want in the mix, the relative rates of those species you want in the mix, and how you're going to source that mix. Again, noticing that like all of this is still in the first part that we're not going to go into today. Also knowing that there's this big nature element. There are things that are outside of our control, weather, all kinds of factors that also impact success of reconstructions. So if you want to learn more about those steps of the process, here are just a few places I would advise going. Bowser Online Learning is a vast kind of trove of webinars, recorded webinars, and so forth. Of course, this restoration webinar series. I would point you to the Pollinator Friendly Alliance webinars on their website, and also the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit that's annual. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative has great webinars. I'm not going to say too much more. Grassland Restoration Network, blogs, these are all great places to look. I'm going to actually dive in to the content now, which is site prep. So the prompt for this webinar series was, you have a seed mix, now what? Okay, so now you've already done that first couple of steps. Now we are trying to get the site ready to plant that seed mix. And fundamentally, what site prep is creating a nice clean seed bed where the odds are going to favor the species you put in the ground, the desirable ones. And you're going to minimize competition from the undesirable things. I'm going to go over a couple different paths to get there. Listed here, there's just a few of them. But at the end of the day, what really matters, doesn't matter kind of how you get there, but what you have to do is understand the weeds that are present, their biology, their habits, their ways of propagating. And once you understand that, then you know how to suppress them. And then you can choose lots of different routes to adequately suppress them. This is the most important step for success. I won't say too much about this because there's a certain element of this that's self-explanatory, and Shawn is going to go over some of this in his slides after me. But a lot of people, especially agriculture spaces, public lands, they use row cropping, conventional row cropping to prep a site. The major considerations here is just making sure that you're lifting off enough residue so that you can get good seed to soil contact afterwards, that little seedlings can find enough light to get up and express themselves. And you want to understand herbicide carryover and if that will impact your seeds development. This is something a little bit more typical for sites that have really tenacious or perennial vegetation. Sometimes that's old fields, sometimes that's grazing lands, places that sort of have been abandoned for a little while and have a lot of aggressive perennial vegetation. This is sort of the expedient process where you want to hay off litter, so you have fresh regrowth. And then after that, then you would spray herbicides so that you're only spraying green vegetation and not all that other dead vegetation. Spray off that vegetation in the fall. The next season, you'll burn it off with prescribed fire, burning it off, as you can see down on the bottom photo. Sometimes you'll need to follow with more herbicide, sometimes for a full season, or if you feel like you got adequate suppression of those grasses, then you could potentially even seed in the spring. You'll notice that this process doesn't include any tillage. Some sites, you might feel that you do need tillage because of this thick thatch layer that has developed over many, many years of this site being occupied by perennial rhizomatous grasses. So my advice here is that if you feel like tillage is part of that, needs to be part of this process to break up the thatch, I would front load that action so that you can still have time to deal with the unexpected weeds or maybe expected weeds that come up after that tillage pass. I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of organic site prep methods because I work with a lot of farmers, a lot of them who are smaller scale, who some of these approaches might work for them. Some of these approaches are just good for people who are a little bit not interested in using herbicides. This is a organic site prep guide that Xerces published many years ago now. It's national in scope. So there's a few nuances that are, if you have questions about how to do this in Minnesota, I'm happy to work with you on that. Each one of these color-coded rows shows like a whole chapter in this guide, so it's worth exploring. I'm going to go over just two that are a little bit more scalable for larger sites. This is one approach called solarization that I probably wouldn't recommend doing on anything larger than a 1/4 acre just because of the cost of plastic. But the idea here is that you do these different steps. You cultivate a site, you bury thick UV stable plastic so that there's no cool air getting in there. And the idea is that the sunlight, and this works best in full sun, the sunlight is actually baking the first few inches of soil, baking the like minimizing viability of weed seeds and cooking other kinds of unwanted vegetation. Then you pull back the plastic and don't do any more tillage and you seed directly onto that. I don't recommend using this per se on anything with deep rhizomatous perennials. Here's just an example of one farm that used one piece of plastic at least twice. You can see on the left, people are seeding a spot that had this plastic on it for the full season. So this is the fall. They then flipped that entire piece of plastic on the long edge and are using it again to prep the next year's planting. So this is kind of what that looks like. In effect, this is a little bit grainy photo, but you can see like year 2 is the one that's 2 years post seeding, and year 1 on the right is the one that is only 1 year post seeding. So you can get multiple seasons out of plastic in this way. Some people, especially some small diversified vegetable farmers, are using silage tarp as a weed suppression tool. So I thought I would just highlight kind of the differences between solarization versus what we might call occultation, or like blackening the soil. And these are both used best in sunlight, but occultation doesn't necessarily require that as much. They both need UV stable materials, so thick plastic. The solarization, it is pretty essential that you cover the soil edges. Occultation, not so much. Sometimes some people are even pulling back the plastic to let things germinate and then putting it back on once the weeds have germinated. It's kind of more of a stale seed bed situation. I think that it doesn't cook it doesn't cook the soil, and so the seeds can just remain dormant. So it can work, especially if you already have these materials on hand, you're using for other purposes. But I just wanted to highlight some differences there. Another technique is called smother cropping. These are high density cover crops. Usually, again, working with farmers who are already familiar with using these kinds of materials in different crop rotations. So they understand the termination cycles, and they're familiar with these materials and how to manage them for weed control. So these can work, and this is an organic, scalable approach. There's a couple of different options. In the upper Midwest, I would kind of recommend sorghum Sudan grass, which you see on the top there, if you have the mechanical equipment to mow it down and to deal with the residue afterwards. So here's an example of a site that used sorghum Sudan grass. You can see on the top in the fall or late summer, they mowed it down, they baled it off, because when you have this high biomass, you have to remove the biomass before you can get seed in the ground, right? So it's hayed off. Then the bottom left picture, you can see there's still enough litter that they decided to burn the site to try to reduce that material on the top of the surface. Then the seed was mixed in a big bin with wood shavings, and then distributed in buckets by hand, and seeded across the site kind of in a grid. The first year post seeding, so there's a spring seeded project. By October of 2022, basically nothing had grown. That's partly because of spring seeding, and some of those seeds needed stratification, but also there's a little bit of allelopathy that comes with sorghum Sudan grass, kind of preventing other things from growing. By the next season, though, things were already starting to take off, those expected annuals, biennials, and by the third growing season, those early successional species were already showing up and doing great. Tillage as site prep. Tillage is organic. It comes with consequences usually, and I almost never recommend it as a standalone thing. I like to pair it with other things, either with herbicide or with some kind of smother crop process, because it really brings up all kinds of weeds, and particularly can be really challenging with any kind of deep-rooted rhizomatous perennial weeds like Canada thistle, just because tillage can drag around those species, and those species can just proliferate. So you have to know what you're doing when you bring tillage into the process for site prep. Okay, I'm breezing through this, but I put a irresponsible amount of content in here, so I'm gonna run through it fast. Plant establishment. So this is like phase 4. There's lots of different times that you can put seed in the ground. Usually we're trying to get a lot of forb diversity in prairie reconstruction sites. So for that reason, I would advocate for kind of dormant seeding so that you can get a lot of those forbs, that winter cold stratification, so that they can germinate possibly in that first year. There are other times to do it successfully. Spring seeding can work. It tends to favor the grasses, but it can definitely work. I wouldn't do summer seeding. Research shows that's the least likely to have success. However, there are some species like strawberries that might be most successful if you were to seed strawberries in the summer, because that's when they would naturally be dropping seed and being integrated into the soil. So it's something to consider. You could even consider sowing your different types of functional groups at different times of year to maximize kind of quick germination. There's a lot of different ways to get that seed on the ground. I guess what I'm highlighting here is that a lot of our prairie species are very, very small, and we don't want to bury them deep. A lot of plant establishment failures are because things were buried too deep. The top, you're seeing a little tiny furrow created by a no-till drill from like a native no-till drill, where things are just a 1/4 inch or less set on this little furrow in the surface, but most things can be surface sown with great success. What I'm trying to show here, these are images from Prairie Moon Nursery. You can see that they have this dime showing, a dime is 3/4 of an inch, right? And for scale, if we want things less than 1/4 of an inch or just surface sown, you can see kind of the different seed sizes. Anything that's like in this penstemon size, 100,000 seeds per ounce or smaller, definitely need to be surface sown. There's a lot of different ways to get the seed on the ground. You can do this by hand seeding. It's worth the time and the tediousness to really grid this out and make sure that you are really spreading out the seed with some kind of carrier. I like to use like a tiny bit of moist sawdust, or lots of other inert carriers can work. Sometimes it makes sense to actually roll the site with a cultipacker afterwards. There are ways to do this mechanically with a no-till drill or with a broadcaster, Vicon spreader. These are easy to operate. They can be attached to lots of different kinds of equipment. I'm going to let Shawn explain more about these. And if you still have questions about these two steps of the process, I would point you to some of these technical guides by the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I really appreciate these resources. They go into a lot more detail of things I already kind of explained. The next part that I want to highlight here is, this is kind of the experimental part of my presentation, where I'm offering ideas about bringing seed into the process in this last phase. So thinking of interseeding as an actual management strategy for long-term management. So that's what I'm going to go into next with the little bit of time I have left. I'm probably over time. And that is that many of our reconstructed prairies look like this top photo. It has Monarda, some of the coneflowers, some of these overrepresented plant families. A lot of our prairie reconstructions look very similar to each other. And research shows that we continually keep missing certain families from our reconstructions that do live in remnants. There are a lot of reasons for that, but I think that there's a real good case for constantly trying to reintroduce these different plant families into our reconstructions to make our prairies as resilient and wildlife supportive as possible. So I think there's a lot of good cases for shifting the paradigm of not just planting a prairie once and managing it, but rather planting a prairie and continuing to plant and add seed over time. Because we live in a landscape where seeds are not going to get to the site unless we plant it. Unless, some of you public land managers live in this luxurious landscape where there's actually remnants and contiguous reconstructions all next to each other. That's a different context than like what a lot of our reconstructions look like in farm land. So if we want the seed in the ground, we have to put it there, even if that means at really small rates. And that way we can continually tip the balance towards that native resilient vegetation that's going to resist invasives and minimize aggressive grasses. Sometimes the seed isn't available in one year. We can reintroduce it the second year or subsequent years. There's a lot of fun and experimentation in this. I think this is a way to add diversity to marginal areas that maybe are never going to get full reconstruction. So we can just be adding economical things to enhance diversity. Xerces has a guide on this. It's one of the only guides out there that I'm aware of. What I'm showing you on the top is kind of like the outline of this guide, like what is interseeding, how do you do it? What are the species that research shows can work? What are the strategies if you're starting with a cool season grass stand or a warm season grass stand and so forth? But fundamentally, it's 3 steps. It's suppressing the existing vegetation adequately in order to get an opportunity to seed more diversity. And then the 3rd step that can't be forgotten is continuing to manage against that initial kind of dominant grass in order to support the wildflowers that you just put in the ground. So here I'm going to just show a couple of examples of what interseeding can look like, sort of experimental here. So this is where I'm going to get into like the creative just storytelling of this, and we'll come back maybe another time with results. So in this interseeding strategy, this is a site that was dominated by warm season grasses, Canada goldenrod. We burned it in the spring, paid off that vegetation in late summer, kind of when the goldenrod was starting to bloom, brought in goats to just pick off more litter after the haying. Then there's a dormant seeding, and then next year there will be another summer haying. At this site, we are selecting species that are spring blooming, that could potentially, I'm going back for a second, that could potentially suppress grasses like hemiparasitic plants, like wood betony, things that can fill that spring bloom gap, things that are missing plant families. These are just a few of the species that will be interseeded here. Let's see. There is a lot of creative ways to do this. The first, I'm just showing an example here. Last year was a huge masting year for oak, bur oak. So we collected on our farm, we collected a whole bunch of acorns and just threw it out into prairies where I knew there were a bunch of gopher mounds. And this year I'm seeing little oak seedlings. I want that kind of diversity in my prairies as well. We have also created little native plant nurseries of a certain species, the higher density spot where I know I'm going to get good seed set. I can use that seed later to disperse into other parts of prairies. This can be used on public lands as well. We've also grown small plugs of things that we can interplant into prairies, things that are harder to come up from seed, things like some of the blazing stars, some of the other small seeded things that tend to not come up as well. This is also like the creative farmer kind of approach. So on the left, what I'm showing you is my husband who was growing rye for a cover crop, and we harvest the rye before at enthesis. So that's like before it starts to create pollen. And then we dry it and blow it onto our vegetable crop fields using this thing called a bale shredder. And we use that as a mulch. So then I thought, well, we also have these native prairie strips all over the farm. Let's bale those off and use that to disperse the native seed and native material into kind of degraded oak savanna edges where we want to keep pushing back the invasive shrubs and get more herbaceous material on the ground to burn. So this is kind of how that experiment is looking. We're baling off native hay. We've done both early season and late season to capture different kinds of seeds. We blow it into the forest edge. And then the next year, native grasses start to establish, and then we can use the oak leaf drop and those little grasses to start fueling more fire into the oak woodlands. I'm also kind of giving these examples knowing that you're going to have an oak savanna webinar coming up. So just showing a couple of images of what that can look like. I also am inviting storytelling around oak savanna restoration because I think this is something that a lot of us are experimenting with. And I'm not doing anything super novel here, but what I'm just trying to do is invite a conversation around this and show that seeding can occur. Multiple seeding events can really enhance and push these projects forward. So here's just 4 years of experiments in oak savanna restoration on our farm. This is where we cut buckthorn down and had goats graze it. We had goats continue to graze the regrowth. We've been interseeding. You can see some of those little grass seedlings starting to come up. These are mostly the cool season rise and that kind of thing. We're burning after oak leaf drop. We are continuing to interseed and continuing to graze and continuing to mow and continuing to interseed after burns, particularly in the fall. And starting to see some results. I know you can't see any particular details in here, but this is where, you know, we're starting to see the rudbeckias, the certain like early successional flowers coming in and starting to see a difference, but it needs additional seed. It needs all these other steps of the process too. And I am going to leave it there because I'm already running over. I want to make sure that Shawn gets time to talk too. So thank you, everybody. I will stop sharing and let Shawn take the lead here.
Thank you, Karin. That was an awesome introduction to all the different techniques. I really like that solarization stuff as well. So kind of wish we could use that on like a quarter section of land and really reduce some of the weeds. That would be kind of cool. So I get this going here. Hopefully everyone can see. So I'm going to talk more specifically about the exact ways that we're able to accomplish upland restoration in the Detroit Lakes Wetland Management District. The techniques have been fine-tuned probably over the last 40 years or so as we've assessed the results and then adjusted various aspects of the process. We have had good results with these processes, but I know other stations have perfected alternative methods that also work for their situations. So, while there is no right way or wrong way to do this, I never want to go back to a site and have to restore it again. I would prefer to move on to the next one. All right, so this is where we are in the landscape. Give me 1 second here, see if I can move this. All right. The Detroit Lakes Wetland Management District is the 5 counties shown there in the state of Minnesota. We manage waterfowl production areas in northwest Minnesota, along with the Hamden Slough National Wildlife Refuge. The Detroit Lakes District lies within the 2 well-known landscapes, the Prairie Pothole region, which is a complex of wetlands surrounded by grasslands that only comprises about 10% of the waterfowl breeding habitat in North America, but produces about half of the continent's waterfowl. And then the northern tallgrass prairie, which is the most precipitous and easternmost of the 3 prairie types. And that was and still is maintained by climate and disturbances like grazing and fire. So those 2 landscapes overlap and are critical not only to waterfowl production, but also to grassland and wetland obligate wildlife. And I know that last slide was basic review for most of you, but our location in the Prairie Pothole region and the northern tallgrass prairie drives our restoration goals. Each wetland management district and National Wildlife Refuge has habitat management plans to guide restoration and management actions through goals and objectives. In Detroit Lakes, our habitat management plan goal is that our restorations should mimic native plant communities. To meet that goal, we have objectives for our seed mixes. A couple of the objectives are to use local ecotype seed. The more local, the better, ideally within 30 miles. Secondly, to ensure the seed mix has at least 50% of the plants that are listed in the Native Plant Communities Minnesota Field Guide, which is also known as the Red Book. And third, making sure that native forbs make up at least 40% of the mix and that native grasses do not exceed 60% of the mix. The bottom line is that we want our restorations to look like native prairie in every way for waterfowl production and to benefit other prairie obligate wildlife and plants. Some of our older restorations missed the mark on that. The wall of big blue stem you see here is what many of our older restorations look like. There are some forbs hiding down low, but for the most part, this is a monotypic stand of grass. Looking back, the seed test showed us that we rarely would hit a 50-50 or even 60-40 mix of flowers to grasses in those older restorations. We seeded too much grass because we harvested too much grass. So we took a closer look at our past restorations and we monitored seedings to observe the progression during the establishment phase. The amount of grass in the seed mix was reflected in what we saw on the ground during monitoring. We also think that the amount of grass in the seed mix was suppressing the ability of some flowers to establish. Even though 20 or 30 species of flowers were listed on the seed test, many of those species, other than the goldenrods, asters, and yellow coneflower, were in such small amounts, they were barely detected given the quantity of big blue stem. Although we'll never perfectly replicate the native prairie in any of our restorations, this is a long ways from representing native prairie. Our monitoring showed us that what you seed is what you get. In order to improve our restorations, we had to improve our seed harvest. Almost all the seed I use in my restorations is harvested off of native prairie sites within 30 miles or so of the restoration site. We try to harvest from recently burned prairies, typically spring burned prairies, although we have harvested from fall burned prairies. Fall burning of prairies is said to give a better forb expression, whereas spring burning of prairies tends to help the grass expression. From what I've seen, while there may be some truth to that, I think it depends more on the site itself rather than the timing of the burn. But regardless of the timing, recently burned prairies produce lots of seed. We have harvested off of unburned prairies and have found a major reduction in the seeds per acre and also the viability of those seeds. In September and October, we harvest the sites with combines. However, throughout the summer, we're assessing the potential harvest sites to prioritize the harvest of those sites based on forb richness and forb abundance. Sometimes if a site has an overabundance of grass, especially big bluestem, we'll wait to harvest that site until half or more of the bluestem seed is dropped. Selecting and harvesting sites based on forbs has allowed us to now attain seed mixes that meet our goals and objectives in our habitat management plan, which has changed the structure of our restorations from big bluestem dominated stands to our closest replication of native prairie. When it comes to upland restoration, we typically prepare the seed bed using Roundup Ready soybeans the year before our seeding. Roundup is short-lived in the soil, so we don't need to worry about chemical carryover, and soybeans are a nitrogen fixer, thus giving us a boost of free fertilizer. When the soybeans are harvested the year before our seeding, we leave the stubble and the ground is not tilled. We have seeded into dicamba soybean stubble, although most farmers are now going away from dicamba and back to a Roundup 2,4-D mix. While it's a small sample size at this point, it does not appear that the dicamba has any effect on the seeding. And we've been pretty lucky in not seeing chemical carryover from farming, but I know that other stations have not been as lucky. And in order to have a successful restoration where they believe they have a chemical carryover issue, those stations are fallowing the field for a year to allow the chemicals to wash out of the soil. We always want to put the seed on the ground in the location where it has the best chance for success. If the seed was harvested from a gravel ridge, then that seed needs to be planted in a dry xeric location. If the seed was growing on the edge of a wetland, then it needs to be planted in a low wet area. We bag each harvest site seed separately, so no seed is mixed until we're out in the field. We use multiple seed lots on each restoration, but those lots are suited for the type of ground they are being seeded on. So if you notice in this picture, the bags on the top of the Vicon have different colored tags on them. Those are different lots harvested from different prairies that are being mixed as we progress through our seeding. We are tank mixing the lots as we seed. We also purchase hand harvested seed and mix that seed in too, and we use staff to hand harvest as time allows. The seed we look to purchase or hand harvest with our staff are the species we don't get in the combine harvest. The combine is only harvesting the seed that is ripe at the time the combine passes over it. Species that bloom and produce seed early and species that rarely show up in the combine harvest are what we're targeting for hand collection. Obviously, purchasing hand harvested seed is very expensive compared to combine seed, and hiring a vendor to only combine is cheaper than purchasing combine seed that has been tested and bagged up. So we try to keep costs low while getting the best seed locally available. I strive for a seeding rate of 2 million pure live seed per acre, which is about 46 seeds per square foot. Pure live seed, or PLS, that's the best way to talk about seed and seeding rates. When we are seeding the mix straight from the combine and not cleaning the seed first, we have stems and leaves in there. And that's what we call bulk seed. A mix that has a lot of stems might need 40 pounds per acre in order for us to hit our 2 million pure live seed per acre goal. When the combine's dialed in better, we may only need 18 pounds of bulk to get our 2 million pure live seed. And that's determined through some math and based on the seed test telling us how many pure live seed we have per pound of that particular lot. 2 million PLS per acre or 46 seeds per square foot, the literature is really all over the place on what rate you should seed native prairie species. Some of the early CRP mixes of exotic grasses were in that 15 to 20 seeds per square foot. Early literature on native mixes that had more forbs, they were in that 20 to 40 seeds per square foot. And some other literature says 40 to 60 seeds per square foot. So we strive for 2 million seeds per acre, but because we can never perfectly set the equipment, we never exactly hit that rate. Every lot of seed flows through the Vicon differently. If the bulk seed has a greater proportion of chaff, it will flow more slowly. If more sunflowers are in the mix, it will flow through the Vicon pretty quickly. Thanks to many different measuring tools on cell phones and tablets and even Trimble units in the cabs of the tractor, we can tell exactly how far we've seeded and how much area the seed is covered. So a Vicon typically throws the seed about 7 feet on each side for a swath of about 14 feet wide. And since each bag of seed is weighed, we know that one bag weighs 35 pounds. Unfortunately, there is math involved at this point, but it's fairly simple to calculate your rate after each bag when you know how far you've traveled and thus how much area you've covered. In the earlier years, staff at Detroit Lakes drilled all the seed, which was primarily grass, when restoring upland habitat. In 1984, the Detroit Lakes Wetland Management District began experimenting with broadcast snow seeding. It started as a small 1-acre plot and was seeded by hand. And after that initial plot, gravel and fertilizer spreaders and even modified Truax drills were used to broadcast the seed. Eventually, the district settled on Vicon spreaders, which work great because they can handle the seed uncleaned or straight out of the combine. So today there might be reasons to drill, and some stations still do so, but we've shifted over to using only Vicons by the late 1990s. And by 2005, we had sold all 6 of our drills. And I think Vicon has recently either been bought out or merged with Land Pride. The new Land Pride broadcasters look very similar to the Vicons, other than using black paint versus red on the frame of the machine. As it sounds, snow seeding is broadcasting the seed onto the snow. Typically, we wait till February or March when the snow is melting so that we limit the seed's exposure to environmental events like wind and biological events like birds and rodents eating the seed. As the snow melts, it turns that top layer of soil to mud, and the seed sets itself at the depth it needs to germinate. Some grasses like being deeper in the soil, like 1 inch deep, while other flower species like asters and goldenrods that have that fluffy seed, they like to be right at the top of the soil, barely covered at all. Seeding during the dormant season also gives the plants the full growing season to grow, unlike seeding in June or even early July. We believe that dormant season broadcast seeding best replicates Mother Nature's way of doing things. And research has shown that seeding during the dormant season and seeding using a broadcast seeder will give you the best diversity and the lowest amount of thistle early in the establishment phase. And another reason we snow seeded is because we needed to be able to see where we had been in the field. We didn't want to double seed areas while skipping other parts of the field, and being able to see the tracks in the snow was a very reliable way to make sure the field was covered. But now, thanks to technology, we are not limited to only seeding on the snow. That's really opened the entire fall window up for us to seed. The picture on the left shows this John Deere with a Trimble GPS map and auto steering from a seeding I did last fall. The Trimble allows us to know exactly what has been seeded or not, and the auto steer makes perfectly straight lines and spacings, so we don't leave any skips, and we have the exact same overlap on each pass. Another benefit of fall seeding is that you don't have to deal with huge snow drifts. And even though we have tracks on all our equipment, some snow drifts can be a challenge in March when the snow is melting and won't support a 5,000-pound piece of equipment. The one rule I do stick to when fall seeding is to make sure that the seed gets locked in the soil and is not going to float in the snowpack for the entire winter. If seeding on fall snow, I check the forecast to make sure the snow will not be sticking around very long before it melts in and takes that seed into the soil. When restoring prairies, it's important to manage your expectations. Every restoration has to go through a healing process after years of tillage and chemicals and soil compaction and erosion. It's important to remember that prairie restorations are dynamic. Each change within and between years, and not one prairie restoration is like another. Each follows a different trajectory to establishment, and really the key is patience. As the seeding progresses, annual weeds are pretty much phased out. Native grasses fill in, litter layer accumulates, and bare ground becomes minimal. Perennial natives become more common throughout the seeding, but I know philosophies differ on whether new seedings should be mowed during the first couple growing seasons. The idea is to remove any cover that would hinder the establishment of natives so the young plants can receive sunlight needed to grow. In Detroit Lakes, we do not mow early seedings, but instead let nature take its course and let the seeding heal itself. We've never felt that there was a negative impact by leaving the vegetation standing. And in fact, weedy flowers provide some nectar and pollen sources for pollinators, while important natives are establishing. And numerous seeds found in the new seedings provide that abundant food source for many birds. Our monitoring has looked at the expression of newly seeded species annually during the first few growing seasons, and years 2 and 3 are typically the best for new species expressing themselves. Native species expression will start slowing down between 4 to 6 years, and the seeding tends to stabilize. This may be a sign that a release burn is necessary to stimulate new species expression and growth. It is important to note that even after that release burn, there may still be native species that haven't germinated, and that's just the ecology of certain species. Often we do receive thistle complaints and are asked to mow the entire seeding or areas most visible to the public. Mowing for thistle in midsummer, when the thistle is flowering, is the same peak time when our native forbs are also establishing and blooming. We conducted a study to explore thistle and native forb frequency in plots that received different mow treatments. We found that mowing plumeless thistle gave similar results as not mowing. Plumeless thistle is a biennial, and whether you mow it or not, eventually the diverse native seeding will outcompete it. Mowing Canada thistle can be risky. According to one study, there is a short window that after flowering, when mowing might reduce seed production. However, if mowing occurs too late or with the wrong equipment, it can actually aid in spreading the seed. During our study, Canada thistle frequency decreased in both the high mow and control plots by nearly 50%. However, the biggest takeaway was that the frequency of forbs in the high mow and control plots were on an upward trajectory from the start to finish. While in the low mow plot, forb frequency was increasing, but stabilizes and might have been decreasing when the project stopped. So based on our study and other research, we don't mow for thistle unless we receive a complaint. To wrap this up, I know I'm running short on time, so I just wanted to mention that there are many more fine details that I didn't touch on, but that's the basics of how we restore our uplands. Overall, I feel that it's all the little things we do throughout the entire restoration process that gets us to where we want to be. I think there might be a little time for questions, so I'd be happy to answer them as well. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. I would say I was inspired, and your presentations have inspired a lot of questions. So let's have at it. I want to start from kind of the beginning. Karin, you use the word reconstruction a lot, and one of the questions is you don't use restoration or rehabilitation. Can you kind of define why you use reconstruction instead of those other terms?
Yeah, I should have defined my terms. It's a good question. I think of reconstruction as something that has no signal of the former native plant community that was there. And so these are crop fields or otherwise completely reconstructed from scratch kinds of situations. And restorations, I try to reserve for situations where there is something there that we are enhancing through management, through possibly some interseeding. But there's something there that isn't, that you're hanging on to, that you want to preserve. I don't know. I probably don't use it the same way that everybody else does, but that's what makes sense in my head.
Thank you. And I'm going to kind of throw out to both of you seeding rates and how we perceive and talk about those. And Shawn, could you address, like, historically, you're using a pretty high seeding rate now that you're using bulk seed. How does that compare to what you would have used if you were using cleaned seed and knew the viability of the seed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the viability, we do know that on our seed tests, and that is taken into account for the total amount. To me, the seeding rate is, there's so much literature that is competing on both sides as far as what rate you should use. And just having done this for 20 plus years, it seems like it doesn't matter as much whether you're at, so in our case, we're shooting for 2 million pure live seed per acre. We've had some seedings that we were about 1.5 million, or we've had some other seedings because we just couldn't dial our equipment down tight enough that we were over 3 million pure live seed per acre. And when you go back and look at those, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I think what matters more is soils, and then the other things you can't control, such as the weather and the climatic conditions, that when you seed, you don't know what's coming for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. So I think that plays into more of it than the actual seeding rate. But yes, you can look at the literature. There's books, the Shirley book. There's a bunch of books on that, and they're just kind of all over the place. So it's hard to say this is the rate everyone should use. So that's my take on it.
Karin, can you add anything to that for us, please?
Yeah, I think something that's often overlooked, and when we talk about just total seeding rates, is that they're comprised of individual species that have different biology. So like each seed is not equal to the next. And so I think like some minimum level of a seeding rate, and generally we talk like 40 seeds per square foot. But if you're adding certain species that research shows you need at least like 10 seeds per square foot to get anything to show up, then that's going to inflate things, so like if you want that species, then suddenly we might need 50 seeds per square foot. So I think just thinking about like who you want to show up and then what rates you need to put in to make those meaningfully occur. That's sort of one way to think about it. The other thing to think about is like, ultimately, when the plant community is established, you're going to look down and see like anywhere from 1 to maybe 7 different plants in 1 square foot. And so, putting 100 seeds per square foot, I don't know, maybe that's too much, or maybe, but you need something because there's chance involved, right? And you're not going to have every species in each square foot. You're going to spread out that distribution. And so I think the more important thing is like getting a lot of diversity in, and then having some minimum amount. I think it is worth also comparing like standards that people have created, like the DNR or the NRCS, and then comparing that with like what seed vendors offer in their seed mixes that they want to guarantee establishment in, and think about like what, just it's an interesting comparison to see what they want to guarantee as their product versus like the minimum standard that certain agencies will require. So
Thank you.
A few thoughts.
Shawn, I'm going to throw another one to you. Are you able to find enough local remnants to harvest from? And then how does that relate to, once you've established a restoration, are you able to use that and do you use those as seed sources as well?
Excellent question. We are very lucky in Northwest Minnesota to have quite a few remnants, and large remnants, sometimes owned by the Minnesota DNR S&A program or the Nature Conservancy. DNR Wildlife has some, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has some as well, but different goals as to what those different agencies bought over time kind of tells you what they have for remnants or not. But yes, we are very lucky in that regard. I will say quickly, I'm very concerned that even the highest quality remnants are still seeing weeds and other things come in that we don't want there, especially when we're trying to harvest off of something that's supposed to be very pristine, whether it's just bird's foot trefoil or smooth brome grass. It's something is always trying to creep into even those best prairies we have left. But we are very lucky on that. We have looked at potentially harvesting off of some of our own restorations. While that is still a possibility, as Karin was just kind of saying, you can harvest a lot of species and throw it out there in the seeding, and that doesn't mean you're going to get all of those to grow. And we're not, even in our best replication, it's still not the same as native prairie. So when we have plenty of native prairie to harvest off of, we're probably always going to select those over even our best restoration. There's just the comparison, there's still too big a gap between the two.
Thank you. I'm going to throw this to both of you as well. Suggestions for seeding in what this participant is calling a dynamic soil type. So sites where the soil kind of changes seasonally, and I'm primarily in moisture, of course, depending on rainfall over growing season. And how do you manage that in a restoration, Karin? And for both, I think in terms of maybe seeding and then maybe a little bit in management too.
Yeah. I guess there's the first planting event in which you might consider actually drawing a line, depending on the scale of the site and how easy it is to potentially create a different seed mix. I think both need to be diverse. I think both need to kind of cover some parts, like have species included in the mix that may not be. I'm probably not explaining this.
Oh, you're thinking of overlapping your seed mix?
Yeah, overlapping things that, you know, you might put some dry adapted things in a wetter area, but like mostly it should be things that are adapted to the wet soils and vice versa, versus creating one mix for a whole site and hoping things will just self-sort. That can be an approach. There's also, this is another one of those cases for interseeding, which is like put in a really diverse mix, see how things are kind of sorting out, and then strategically fill gaps in a future management event coupled with fire and a seeding or something like that, where you're like, oh, it looks like this is really doing well here, or this part of the seed mix didn't, you know, flesh out. We got to do something there. We know more about the site now. We've watched it. We can like plan accordingly. It's just, it's dynamic like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Shawn, any thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple, just to expound just a little bit on what Karin said. We have definitely done some what we call microsite seeding, where the whole idea of maybe you had an 80-acre piece, a perfect rectangle, and instead of just driving over everything back and forth with the same seed mix, if there's some topography or in this case, some different climatic things going on, not every piece of that ground gets the same exact seed or doesn't get it at the same time. So while it would be more labor intensive to get the seed out there, whether you're keeping different seed lots separate for different parts of that or coming back at a different time and seeding, I think the main idea would be you can't just blanket the whole thing like would be the quickest way to do it. You might have to spend more time and be more refined on that seeding.
Are either of you using or have used or would recommend using one of the standardized seed mixes, for example, created by MnDOT and Bowser? Are there still sites that are applicable for that? Any comments, Shawn?
I have not used that. I've done a couple seedings in some right-of-ways. So that would probably be a good example where I should have used it. I felt that the seed that I was able to harvest off of some of the best native prairies had more diversity and at the levels of diversity that I wanted those seeds to be in. So therefore I stuck with the easy button and used that sort of seed. But truthfully, I haven't looked at that seed mix in a little while, so I'm not up on it.
Karin, any thoughts?
Yeah, one is that I almost always prefer customizing sites or mixes for each site, which I know isn't practical for a lot of land managers. So sometimes I take a Bowser mix and then kind of spin it by adding a couple things or tinkering. The other thing I'll just say is that Bowser has worked really hard with some partners recently to revise a lot of like 70 or more different mixes on there to increase the diversity for pollinators, for all kinds of different services. So it is worth looking at them again and considering whether they might be appropriate for certain projects you're working on. And they're really customized for like different parts of the state and really different like project goals and things like that. So it's worth taking another look at those.
Great. We've gotten to 1 o'clock. The time flew, and I really appreciate the time that you both shared with us and your expertise. I learned a lot myself, and I'm assuming our audience did as well. Thank you again very much.
Thanks, everybody.